Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Affordable Housing Production Task Force. This is our third meeting. It is now 1:32 on February the 6th, and this meeting is about to get started. So who's ready?
Ready?
All of us.
I need more excitement.
Yeah, we're ready. We're ready.
Yeah. Okay, we're gonna work on enthusiasm, okay?
Got it.
So the very first thing we have on our agenda for today is our welcome and then our roll call attendance. I did a very abbreviated welcome. I was going to do more, but since you all lack enthusiasm, I'm going to kick it to one of my co-chairs to welcome you with grand enthusiasm.
All right. Well, thank you all for being here in person. I appreciate it, Representative Johnson. And I think we have some folks online as well. Thank you guys for being here. This is our third meeting. I know you guys have been meeting with a lot of different subcommittees. We really appreciate all the effort and the discussion that you guys have been having on this topic. We were at a Sussex County Association of Towns meeting yesterday, and it was one of the largest topics of concern is affordable housing. And so we know we have some great talent around the room and online. So really thank you all for the work that you're doing. I also want to kind of give thanks also to former Director Carney for her involvement and engagement, as we also welcome the new Director of DSHA, Matt Heckles, who just got confirmed last week, was it? Okay. That was my like. I thought that was pretty good. Like thanks, Director Carney, and then we.
And I'd like to echo that. I think this group and Director Carney's participation, I think, was really important in bringing DSHA to this table. And I'm thrilled because I think this task force is giving me a head start. I said during the confirmation hearing, and again in a slightly different way, the JFC hearing yesterday, that housing supply is at the root of all of the solutions that we have in housing. We're not going to solve a lot of the other problems around housing unless we address supply. And I think beyond that, for me, I've talked a lot about, it's the simple supply and demand big pictures, but it's also sort of that nitty gritty underneath, right? Whether we have the right supply for, the young first time home buyer family, the right supply of rental housing for, low and moderate income families. It's not just that big number that we all, I think, grown accustomed to saying in shorthand, yeah, we have a housing supply, but it's a lot more detailed and complicated than just that big number. And secondly, I think it was a response to someone yesterday on the JFC hearing. This is a sort of, to me, it's a competitive balance issue. The way I described it is Delaware, I think, has had this proposition for people for decades that this is a high quality of life state with affordable housing and good jobs. And I think that we have gotten away from some of that proposition over the last several years. Our housing is not that much more affordable than it is in other places, if it is at all. And that affects quality of life and it affects the jobs. So, I think it was with Representative Short said, other people are going to be doing this. Other people around the country, it's 4 million units that we're short on supply. So around the country, people are going to be creating housing supply and they're going to be creating affordability. And so that's where we're in competition. And this is important for Delaware to get right so that we can bring back that proposition of high quality of life, affordable housing, and good jobs. And it's done through housing supply. And if we don't do it and we don't do it the right way, someone else will. And we've got to be on the winning side of that. So I certainly appreciate the work of this task force. I know that Governor Meyer and his administration overall is looking at the cost of housing as, again, sort of a shorthand for all of those details that come underneath of that. And it's a priority of his that he started talking about on the campaign trail. But before I was confirmed all of 6 days ago, we were starting to have these conversations. So this task force has given us a head start, and I appreciate all the work that's gone into it. And look forward to picking up here and moving us forward.
So before we do roll, let me just make one comment, because I was just listening, right? And something you said struck me, because I've never thought about it. You want to know what it was?
I don't know what
Sometimes I just get on a roll and,
It was good though, it was good stuff.
Okay, good. All of it then.
Yeah, it really was, because I'm like, oh my gosh, I had an aha moment, okay? Because when I'm thinking about housing needs and productivity, I'm so Delaware focused. I gotta do this for Delawareans. This is what we need. This is what we need. We need it right now. So 2 things. One, you said we are short, what did you say, 4 million?
I mean, depending on the study.
Right,
Yep.
depending on the study,
Sure.
across the United States. So that was just like crap. But what really hit me is the competition that we will experience, because everyone is in the same boat. And if they get it sooner than we get it, we lose.
Time and quality. I think both, right? That's the big yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I'm just like, think about it, a young family, even older folks. I mean, even though we've always asked our older people to come and live here, but as a young family, and you're looking for somewhere to live, and if we don't have our stuff together to attract younger families or people in general, regardless of your age, right? Then they go somewhere else. What does that do?
I know we gotta get on the agenda, but
I know.
one thing. What is the average age of a home in Delaware?
Oh, that's a good
I
question.
was in JC hearings.
My confirmation. All right. 40. About 40, a little over 40 years old. Now, in Pennsylvania, the average age is about 70 plus, which is an indication of how much construction we've made here in Delaware, but also what we build. If we were to magically tomorrow put these 20,000, 50,000 units online here in Delaware and solve our supply problem, those houses are going to be occupied by people for decades, if not longer. So the way that we do this today, the way that we make up this gap, is going to set the tone for housing in Delaware for literally decades. So it's not just the competition. It's not just doing it right, but this is a system. This is an infrastructure that we're building for a long time.
It is the interconnectedness of all things.
So if we get it wrong,
We
We
thank you.
we will always make progress
Yes,
toward the goals.
Yeah.
So.
absolutely. I'm done.
so introductions.
Yes.
Before I call roll, 2 things. One, I was gonna try to close out of my email on the big screen so we don't hear it ding every time I get an email, and now we have that. So we're using DTI to try to fix that for the people in the room. I think the people online, you can still see the meeting agenda, correct? Good, all right, at least they can see.
Okay.
All right, we have paper copies.
Yeah.
That's the first housekeeping item. The second is, as of this morning, our task force member, Mr. Corey Thompson, has resigned from the seat. I checked with Mark Petrona, who is an attorney with the Division of Research, and he indicated that we now have a body of 19, and so we need 10 for a quorum. I need to note that before I call the roll. Yeah. Okay. Director Heckles.
Oh, here.
Senator Huxtable.
Here.
Representative Johnson.
Here.
Senator Hocker, is absent. Representative Pulaski, absent. David Edgel, absent. Kimberly Cole, who is replacing Dana Cobb,
Here.
okay, present. Pam Scott, absent. Sarah Kiefer. Here. Preston Shell,
Here.
Kevin Spence,
Here.
Wes Stefanik,
Here.
Deborah Burgos,
Here.
Mike Ryman is absent. Amy Walls. Here. Jerry Heisler is absent. Kevin Smith,
Here.
Karen Speakman,
Here.
and Rachel Stucker.
Here.
We have 13 of 19 members present. We do have a quorum.
Good. So our next item up for business is the approval of the meeting minutes from October 7th, 2024. I am open to accepting a motion for the approval or edit from task force members.
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes.
Thank you.
Motion.
So
Thank you, Amy.
do we have?
I'll second.
Thank you, Karen, for the second.
Thank you.
I'm gonna do a roll call vote of the members that are present. Director Pickles,
I believe I always abstained.
Senator Huxtable.
Yes.
Representative Johnson.
Yes.
Kimberly Cole,
Abstain?
Sarah Kiefer,
Yes.
Preston Shell. Preston?
Yes.
Thank you. Yes, I can now. Kevin Spence,
Approved, yes.
Wes Stefanik,
Yes.
Deborah Burgos,
Yes.
Amy Walls,
Yes.
Kevin Smith,
Yes.
Karen Speakman,
Yes.
and Rachel Stucker.
Yes.
We have 11 yes and 2 abstaining. The minutes are approved.
Wonderful. Thank you all. So the next item up is an update on our task force timeline, and I will kick it on over to Caitlin for that.
Thank you, Representative Johnson. So at this point, 4 of our 5 subcommittees have approved recommendations to share with the task force. The Manufactured Housing Subcommittee is the one remaining committee that still needs to approve recommendations. They're scheduled to meet on February 18th, during which they will approve recommendations. And then for this meeting, the chairs of the Finance and Development and Community Focus Group subcommittees will present their respective subcommittees' recommendations. Today, we're just hearing the recommendations. Nobody on the full task force is expected to vote on anything today beyond the minutes that were just approved. At our February 20th full task force meeting, the other 3 subcommittee chairs for construction, regulatory and permitting, and manufactured housing will present their subcommittee's recommendations. Again, it's just going to be presenting the information, discussion, public comment, but nobody will be voting on those recommendations on the 20th. Then in March, we have 2 more full task force meetings, one on March 13th and one on March 20th. Those will be the meetings during which full task force members will be expected to vote on recommendations for inclusion in the final report. I imagine after the 20th, we will have an opportunity to potentially combine some of the recommendations from the various subcommittees into new recommendations that capture the spirit of both recommendations. So that will be figured out again once we have all 5 sets of approved recommendations shared out. And then our final report date will be April 7th, 2025. So at that point, it will be shared with the governor and the General Assembly. Any questions on that timeline? All right, great. Hopefully DTI can come soon so that we can get our screen back for people in the room.
I think I did. So, there was an original timeline and a bill passed to extend it. Is that right?
Yes. Oh,
Has the governor signed the bill?
great question. I'm not sure if he has signed it yet. I know that it passed both chambers and now
With him for signature.
And extends it till April, what?
April 7th.
Do I need to ask him to sign that?
I think that would be.
As long as it's done before March, the original, and
Oh, okay,
so.
okay. All right. I haven't touched base with anybody there to see if, you know, where that is. I just thought I would ask.
But touch base today.
Caitlin,
Yes.
what is the final work product though? Is it going just to be a list of recommendations or is it going to be context provided like a report format?
Yes, there will be context that gets put into the report. I'm gonna work with our 5 subcommittee chairs to make sure that we're including the necessary context to accompany the recommendations. We also, have tried to make it clear that there is opportunity to share dissenting opinions where they arise, for inclusion in that final report.
Okay, I assume then our last meeting will be approving the final full document.
If we do it that way, then I will have to have the report drafted by the March 20th meeting. I will see if I can make that happen.
Thank you.
Great question. All right, so.
Hey, Caitlin,
Oh,
House Bill 30 has passed both. I've just passed on the 30th, has not been sent to the governor for signature yet. Has not been signed off, just for the record.
Correct. So my, he has not signed the bill yet, but it has passed both chambers, so now it is being sent to him for his signature.
Yes.
Any logistical questions? All right, I will advance the slides, and first up we have Amy Walls on behalf of the Finance and Development Subcommittee.
Well, thank you, everybody. Caitlin and I were talking about really the format of this discussion, and our goal is to get through all of the recommendations before the committee members have an opportunity to ask questions. So just encourage everyone to just make a note, and if you want to make a note on a particular recommendation number, something that will make it easier for us to go back and forth. But we want to make sure that we can get through everything in our committee with a pretty prolific committee. So we have quite a few recommendations. Wanted to first thank the committee. We really had excellent attendance, high levels of engagement and focus. We had differing opinions, but a lot of respect was held between members where we listened to each other and appreciated those differing opinions. Wanted to thank Caitlin and the other support professionals at DSHA and at the state for really supporting the committee through this work. It's been incredibly helpful. And then also to members of the public, we got some really excellent public comments and tried to consider those in the process. And so we thank you for showing up, for caring, and for giving us really great ideas. The membership here is on the first slide. You can read that, and then you can see the subcommittee charge, the items that we specifically looked at. We did meet 5 times, and we have 18 recommendations to share with you. Let's start. Okay. And I'll give a little context on our recommendations too. So first one is to standardize the definition of affordable housing for government programs to mean housing that's affordable to households making up to 80% of area median income for rental units and 120% of area median income for home ownership units. We find that whenever we talk about affordable housing, people say, well, what are you talking about? Like, what are the numbers? What's the affordability level? And we think that standardizing a definition allows us to have common understanding when we're at the table. It allows for better ease of layering subsidies and programs, for developers. And these limits at 80 and 100% of AMI, we think recognizes that the cost of rent and home purchases in Delaware is rising faster than Delaware's area median income. So, prior levels where we were talking about 50 or 60, even 80% of AMI, for homeownership feels like it just doesn't reach enough of our Delawareans that are really struggling to meet housing costs. And we understand that that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to layer perfectly with HUD programs or other subsidies that exist today, but it's more of kind of a standard definition as we talk about this. And it's not intended to limit programs that want to serve lower levels of affordability. And I did want to just note that HUD does allow some income limits up to 100% for limited use programs such as the Neighborhood Stabilization Program and the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Funds, or SLRF, were designed to support families up to 120%. Well, yes.
And before, sorry, the 18 that you have, are they listed in priority order, or are they just? I just want to know how we're to receive them.
So I tried to group them, and but no, they're not in priority order. So the first one here, we figured we'd start with definition, then assessment, and then we'll go into some collaboration items, and then we're going to end with new tools and then a funding.
Thank you.
Are we supposed to wait for questions?
Yeah.
Okay. It's gonna be hard.
Sorry. Okay. Recommendation 2. We think that DSHA should research the cost of increasing the supply of affordable housing to meet the housing needs identified in the 2023 statewide housing needs assessment. And additionally, we think that future needs assessment should provide some cost estimates for addressing any housing needs that are identified. This will help us to plan, I say us, just as a state generally, to plan and budget for the state's housing needs and give us a better understanding of the cost of trying to meet those needs, so that we can do that going forward. I did want to note too, in the asterisk below, is that the needs assessment isn't like a standard year format. So we've had 5-year needs assessments. We've had some that go for 4 years or 12 years or something to that effect too. So it's not an exact science of when those come out. So we didn't have an opinion on that, but just that trying to quantify the dollar amount that would be necessary to meet the needs will be helpful. Recommendation 3. The state should identify all federal and state funds across executive branch agencies that are being used and can be used to support housing. This will hopefully allow for better coordination and maximize the availability and use of those funds. This is still in my assessment section. And then the last one that I would consider an assessment recommendation is that the Office of Management and Budget should conduct a feasibility study regarding the development of a state affordable housing tax credit. We know that's something that has been drafted as a recommendation to the legislature, and so would love to hear more about that. And we think an assessment would be a great way to start. Yeah, you can't.
It's hard.
It's only hard for them.
I know.
Notes like you told me to. Gentlemen,
Yeah.
I hear you breathing.
Similarly to our definition that we'd like to standardize as it relates to affordable housing is to increase the AMI for eligible home buyers to 120% for the exemption established via SS1 for SB 87 that was passed in the 152nd General Assembly. And you can see my note below that it relates to the exemption of the realty transfer tax, specifically related to the development of affordable housing. Again, this considers the recommendation number 1 and recognizes that the cost of home purchases is rising faster than Delaware's AMI, and is pricing out families at lower income levels and middle income. Recommendation 6. I think this one is more of a state policy item to promote homeownership, and it's to reduce the realty transfer tax to 1% for owner-occupied home buyers with incomes at or below 120% AMI. So we think this complements recommendation 1 as well as recommendation 5.
It's not a question,
Yeah.
but what is the current?
So for the buyer, it's 2%. Yeah, So it would
Usually
reduce it
all in the
from,
buyers.
yeah, I mean, we recognize that sellers often pass, that into the cost of the house, but it's seller 2%, buyer 2%.
So it's 4 total?
It's 4
Fine.
total,
Okay.
3% to the state, 1% to
Yeah.
the local.
Remember that, okay.
Yeah.
We're still doing that.
And yeah,
And there's no exemption for affordable,
There
At all.
is the prior exemption for the development of, but.
okay, but nothing on the purchase side.
now if the local takes 1.5%, they go to 2.
Okay, recommendation 7. The Office of State Planning Coordination should work with local governments and other stakeholders to develop a statewide accelerator program. This would be for residential projects that meet certain density and affordability criteria. The program should include, but should not be limited to, expedited reviews and permits, fee reductions and/or waivers, assistance with financing and grants, and a study to identify where the bottlenecks are in the process to develop affordable housing. This really addresses the speed with which affordable housing can, kind of come to market, as well as some of the costs associated with it. And recommendation 8 is similar, but I do want to point out that it's specifically related to infill development and redevelopment. And so this would be to create more incentives to promote infill development and redevelopment that includes a component of affordable housing, with that different definition of households making up to 80% of AMI for rentals and 120% for home ownership, and state strategies levels 1 and 2. This could also include expedited reviews and permits, fee reductions and/or waivers, and assistance with financing and grants. You're right at the tip of your chair.
Well,
I know,
one, the
stop.
chair is not working correctly. If I get back, it's gonna work back. So I gotta be.
You want
from the
this
chair.
first?
I tend to go. Recommendation 9. We're almost halfway there. The state should encourage bond financing for affordable housing at the county and local government level. This is to help reduce total development costs and to increase the number of financial tools available to affordable housing developers. Okay. Recommendation 10. I think of this one as a couple of these as kind of collaboration. And so this one, DSHA should create additional opportunities to collaborate with developers, community-based organizations, and local governments. This could include conferences, webinars, technical assistance, reference materials, and other training. We think that a reboot of the Governor's Conference on Housing would be incredibly positive. It's strongly suggested by the committee. This really draws on what we were seeing in other states, where states are either providing it themselves or contracting with other agencies to provide a higher level of technical assistance for people who want to do, who want to produce affordable housing and serve people who have housing needs. Recommendation 11. And this is to encourage all of Delaware's public housing authorities to continue to review and create incentives to engage developers and landlords to accept housing choice vouchers. We know that this is a priority of these agencies today. We'd like to see that continue and potentially expand as well. Want to make sure that we are taking advantage of the housing stock that exists today, and having more people be able to utilize their vouchers is one way to recommendation 12. Also in the collaboration front, DSHA should periodically review their financing and housing programs with stakeholders to ensure that products and programs are optimized and effective. Really thinking of kind of the voice of the customer. We know DSHA is doing this in regard to some of their programs. We'd like to see that expanded more broadly. Okay. Recommendation 13. Apply long-term deed restrictions in perpetuity for community land trusts or a community land trust model for all RAD conversions. These are conversions of public housing to either LIHTC type multifamily rental housing with Section 8 contracts. So the definition of RAD is rental assistance demonstration. Okay. Recommendation 14, I have a lot of notes on this one. Okay. Redetermine the cap on the number of projects a developer can have in the pipeline at one time for 4% and 9% LIHTC projects. And LIHTC is the low-income housing tax credit program for multifamily affordable rental housing. And then also examine DSHA's share of the state's bond cap authority to ensure that we are maximizing our housing production. We noted that there's a need to both develop new units while also still investing in existing stock so that we aren't losing units at the same time that we're producing them. And we note that there are long-term restrictions on existing units, but we'd like to take a long horizon look at these to make sure that we have enough developers working in the space to both convert or to create new units, but also ensure we aren't losing any of that existing stock. We also recognize that there's a limited amount of the 9% tax credit available, making the 4% tax credit a valuable tool. However, that tool requires a greater investment in soft debt and grants, which could be limited by the bond cap that's available to the State Housing Authority. We also recognize that more developments in the pipeline will increase the need for staff to underwrite the financing, manage the developments from award to closing, for construction and occupancy and the like. So, there will be an impact on DSHA that we should be prepared for as we increase the amount of development that's taking place. Recommendation 15. This one is to encourage Delaware's public housing authorities and entitlement agencies to institute a right of first refusal for the sale of multifamily rental housing above 4 units that is developed using public subsidies to qualified affordable housing developers if the project and its funding sources allow. So I did want to note that this was not unanimously approved by the committee. It was passed with 5 subcommittee members voting in support and 4 subcommittee members dissenting. In this, again, we recognize that not all funding sources allow there to be those sorts of deed restrictions, but in the event that there are, we think it could be a good way to ensure that existing stock remains affordable. Recommendation 16. This goes back to DSHA and the need to increase its capacity to meet the demands of these recommendations. We think a third party should perform a competitive wage analysis of DSHA staffing to best attract and retain the talent necessary to engage in the financial transactions and underwriting that the state finance agency delivers. We also think DSHA should assess capacity needs to effectively execute its programs. If necessary, the state should provide funding to address any gaps identified by that third-party analysis. Again, we recognize DSHA as a self-funded agency, but if we are going to ramp up quickly, the revenues that they earn is not going to keep pace, at least initially. And so that funding will need to come from somewhere. And the talent's going to be necessary in those seats to ensure that those developments are completed correctly, and following all the appropriate rules associated with all of the funding. Recommendation 17. Develop a mission-driven public-private development fund modeled after the Dallas Housing Opportunity Fund that leverages state funding with private and philanthropic capital to increase the number and volume of low-cost loans and grants available to affordable housing developers. Create a strategic partnership with philanthropic organizations and facilitators of philanthropy, with an example being Philanthropy Delaware. I did, in the asterisk there, provide the website if anyone wanted to look at that specific fund, but it is managed by a community development financial institution, or CDFI, of which we have a number of great ones operating in our state. And it is funded by both the state and private sources. So it's a great public-private opportunity to create additional resources for the state. And then recommendation 18, so hold on to your hats. The state should appropriate $100 million to DSHA annually to support production of affordable housing. Again, with units that are affordable to households making up to 120% AMI for home ownership and 80% AMI for rental, and index future increases to the consumer price index. I did want to note that, if we reference back to recommendation 2, where we specifically are tasking DSHA to consider the cost of housing, this number may be appropriate. We don't think it is, frankly. We did some basic analysis on the average cost for some recent 4% and 9% low-income housing tax credit deals. And I'll say, these aren't exact numbers. This is done by the committee and not DSHA. If we did $100 million annually to create 650 units using both 4% and 9% credits, it will take us 30 years to meet the backlog of the 19,400 units that are needed today, according to the needs assessment. This $100 million only addresses affordable multifamily rental using the LIHTC program. It doesn't address rehabs of existing units. It doesn't address subsidies needed for homeownership or special purpose housing types. So we wanted to throw out a big number because we think it's appropriate, but frankly, we don't think it's enough. And we think that that assessment and recommendation 2 will help us get closer to a number that is manageable, but gives us a really clear picture of what that number is. Okay. That's it for me.
That's it?
That's it.
I'm happy to go back to any previous slide or question. That's the slide back.
Is it possible to go back to number 1? And so, I don't know, tell me if this doesn't work, but I was writing down some questions as we were going along, and I would love to go
Yeah, that
through
makes
them.
sense.
Okay. And I think you guys.
See if we can all add to it, right?
Yeah. I guess for one, my main question was when you say across government programs, you just mean state agencies in Delaware, like DHSS, Office of State Planning, like you're talking.
Like we can't
Well, of course.
control the federal, but
Right.
we would love, even as local jurisdictions are joining the effort to promote affordable housing, it would also create a definition that they could utilize.
This is what we all mean when we say this, with state agencies taking leadership in that definition.
Is this just a sort of cultural thing, or is there a review of state legislation? I remember like at one point, the state went through and did people first language through the entire code and did an entire review of the entire code to see wherever affordable housing was mentioned, it was defined as.
I'm not sure. I'll give you an honest, how deep you want to go on this. But in our feeling, we were very specific in that we didn't want to have to go back and redefine any specific programs. We just wanted a standard definition that we could all work from and talk from. So whether that includes going back and looking at code, it could go that deep. But it wasn't intended to change any existing programs that are designed to support affordable housing to say, now you must then apply those parameters to this definition, because we know that some are designed specifically to serve much lower incomes.
I think I have some helpful
Thank you.
context to share as well. So this affordability question came up a lot in the regulatory and permitting subcommittee. One of our members is Suzanne Moss from DelDOT, and as part of her work, she will expedite permits for affordable housing projects that are flagged by a municipality. So already DelDOT will expedite permits if the municipality says, yes, we consider this an affordable housing project, please, put it at the top of the list. But DelDOT looks to either the municipality or the task force to say, what does that mean? What does affordable housing mean? Affordable for who? So I think there's a desire, at least from the state agencies, to have a standard definition. Okay, if the housing is going to be affordable for renters up to 80% AMI, it ticks the box. Or if it's creating units that are going to be affordable for owners up to 120% AMI, that ticks the box.
And developers, I think, would appreciate the fact that if they are presenting something to DelDOT and asking for expedited review because they're doing affordable, that they're not reliant on a particular jurisdiction to say, we think it is, but we don't. And so whether they're operating in X county or Y county or this city or that city, they have the ability to ideally start from some sort of common language about what is affordable.
Another note is this does not get into the number or percentage of units in a given project that has to be affordable, up to 80% AMI for renters or 120%. We did discuss that. I think we didn't want to limit local governments from coming up with that unit or percentage threshold, but just knowing that if there are units that are affordable to renters up to 80% AMI, they can pick the number or percentage threshold requirement, but we would at least be sticking to the 80% AMI and 20% AMI.
Well, and for
So-
expedited, oh, sorry.
Thank you for the additional information. Why? Because while I went through everything in advance, my number one question for all things is, how does this increase productivity?
Mhm.
And I couldn't figure it out. I'm like, how? What? So by you all explaining that there are mismatches and how DelDOT relies on this, then I understand that. Because I did not. I mean, this is not, I know some things, I don't know all things. And I definitely am not granular to the point of understanding all projects. So thank you for that. I just wanted to-
So, and on that committee, I think also we wanted to make sure that we were saying it's affordable for lower and moderate income families, that we're not setting up programs that serve a higher income, to be frank.
So in some of the legislation that we passed last year, I was trying to be very careful with some of those definitions, and affordable was addressing 80% and below, and we're classifying workforce as above that 80% threshold. I can't remember if it was 100 or 120% that we hit on, because we still can create homeownership units for less than 80% of
Yeah,
income. And so that kind of, what type of unit it is, whatever, who you're trying, I think it matters, the income level. So we were trying to do that a little bit in legislation last year, be consistent with affordable, even though affordable, even defined as 80% below, is still workforce housing, because that's where a lot of our families and Delawareans are. So I was trying to be mindful of that in some of the language.
So I think, I can't speak for everybody. I think that I think as a committee, we'd be open to that kind of discussion if we wanted to say affordable is this and workforce is this, as long as the state government is funding programs that those two groups of people, households of income, I think that would be acceptable. So those kind of things can be massaged
Yeah.
later. I think we take your suggestions as sort of being in the legislature, what would work, right, too, a little bit. But not totally. We want to push the envelope.
Yeah, I think we do push the envelope a little bit. I mean, because frankly, the AMI is not raising at the level that home prices are rising. And so, it is pricing people at 120%. They're being priced out. They're not having the opportunity to purchase. And if we consider how quickly people are moving into our state from other areas with, a higher level of assets or a higher level of income,
Yeah.
we're competing against that. And the person at 80% is having an incredibly difficult time, but the person at 120% is still struggling.
I mean, so for me, I always thought sort of the top of, affordable rental housing was around 80%, and the top of homeownership was around 120. So I don't disagree with sort of setting maximum. agreeing on terminology, nothing's more frustrating than the US Department of Education having one definition of homelessness, not having another. I would ask maybe the subcommittee to think about what is it that happens that we say that we've done this? Because I don't see that. I don't understand, and I'm to your point about, well, maybe some programs need to be at 50 and some need to be at 140. I don't know how this. I don't
This
know
is the top level.
I don't know how we check the box and say this is
The top level, though.
Yeah, but in our mortgage program, we can go over 120 in certain circumstances, and there are some places where you might want to do that.
Then I think then now we didn't have probably the benefit of knowing that, because like, should rental go to 100%? I mean, I think showing the needs, if you come back with the needs assessment and says, clearly, here's what we should do, then maybe that's something that would be.
If you're creating home, rental for teachers, you might want to do something at 100% that has, very good public good that isn't necessarily affordable housing. So I think this is good. I just don't understand exactly how it's done and what it means when we do.
I was just gonna say, I think your point about we're not trying to apply this to all of the programs being implemented. It's more about when we talk, when Del Dot is talking about, is this an affordable housing project? When,
And so for that purpose, I think, we need that. We need
like, I
something,
think those
but
two
that's
things are different.
But that's
Like,
where we are.
doesn't mean your
We're still-
mortgage folks couldn't help people above 120. It just, I think those two things can both be happening at the same time.
This seems like a philosophical agreement that we all need to come to, but I'm not sure that, how it's.
I do want to do a
Totally.
quick time check because I know we do have to get to Rachel's comments here, so if we could move to the next.
Oh,
Oh, you're just stuffing me up a question.
No, I'm not saying we have to meet Rachel just yet, but I know we were hoping to try to get through some questions by 2:30 to allow Rachel plenty of time and to do the.
Sorry, so are we still doing questions? Okay, two. My question's super quick about recommendation number 2, which is, I thought the needs assessment did do that in some way. And so clearly that I think I've misunderstood. Can you clarify? So, okay, this is not a clear question. I'm so sorry. Cost to who, I guess is my question, because the cost to the state is gonna vary depending on what federal resources are available or what
No, it's like
private
the total
market
cost.
resources.
It's the total cost.
Okay.
For us to do 20,000 units, what's the total cost?
Yeah.
Not
Or
just the cost to the
40,000,
state.
right.
Not just
The
cost,
total
the
cost.
total
Yeah.
cost, and we
So that-
recognize.
Okay.
Yeah, no, then you figure out what the state, wherever the state is roughly. I mean, we
Yeah.
can have to analyze.
600 million.
So for instance, we think that if
Got that.
for recommendation 18 related to the $100 million of the state, based on our, analysis, our analysis, back of the envelope
Back of the
analysis,
envelope.
we think that it would leverage $135 million of private resources. So, if we look at, the cost $235 million for those, 600 units based on what we kind of back of the envelope did, that would be, 100 to the state, 135 and leverage.
Three? To start.
No, but my
Start
comment
within
was
the
kind
show.
of hard to do because I think there's a lot of variability and all of that stuff. So it's nice to put a number on it. Much sure.
I think it's like a wage set, right?
Yeah.
It's a start.
For 3, I was just hoping the word affordable could be put in front of housing, to support affordable housing. But maybe the point is not that it's all the funds that support affordable housing, it's all the funds. And then. I don't know if that matters.
I don't know that it matters.
Okay.
Because I think we wanna know, what we don't know, what we
Yeah.
hear.
Yeah.
Is that there are all these pots of money, right, that they're not well coordinated. Let's find out what those pots of money are and let's coordinate.
Yeah, thank you. Next one.
I don't have anything for.
So I mean, this one is something that I know there's folks who are looking at it. I think there's some variabilities that may impact Delaware with CRA, reg rewrites, and some other stuff that's happening in the States. So yeah, I would certainly like, there's, yeah, 3 tiers of financing, there's equity, there's debt, there's grants, and we don't have an equity piece in the state. So it's something to certainly be.
When I've done research on this in the past, it's not the best use. The return on the dollar of the tax credit is at the state level, sometimes 30 or 40%, because there just isn't that much demand for tax liability. Even at the national level, when you have this huge pool in LIHTC, you're looking at under $1. And so, you know, if the IRS came to us and said, listen, we're not going to give you tax credits, $3 million a year or whatever it is, we're going to give you cash for that, I would take that instead.
Oh, yeah.
And so that if the state is going to reduce its income by X dollars, I would much rather have the cash of X dollars than the tax. So, I mean, that's my general, I love the concept. I love the idea of new resources. I don't think a tax credit at the state level, when I've looked at it in the past, unless there's something, like you said, different about the market here in Delaware that would somehow create leverage with that. It's not an efficient way to fund housing.
That's what we suggested, a study.
Yes, that's how we think an assessment is in order.
Fair enough.
I always call tax credits the
You want OMB to
backwards
do
way.
that?
Yeah, backwards way of
funding
financing.
Do you want OMB to do that? Is that,
Well,
the recommendation is that OMB do that?
we can discuss like where it needs to be, because finance and, you know, insurance and all this kind of stuff, we can take a look at. I mean, these are just recommendations that we're moving forward, so, or at least, so we'll figure.
Yeah.
you know,
Get there.
some of these might not end up in the
Yeah,
report,
exactly.
but they, you know, drop the kernel with someone to start, you know, trying to figure something out. And I think in our case, regarding the credits, in the 80s, we went to the federal low income housing tax credit program to reduce the size of government. And so you don't look at the revenue side, you look at the budget side. And so when you have $1 billion put into the 515 program, that's now what, 30 million maybe? I don't know.
It's terrible, yeah.
Right. And we're producing less housing because we moved it. It looked like we were lowering the cost of government from $1 billion to 30 million. Didn't we do a great job? But we moved it over to a
Tax law.
complicated tax situation with the Department of Treasury. And, you know, it probably costs more money to do it than doing direct lending. So anyway.
Just say all the time at HUD. It's no wonderful that our tax collectors have
Yeah.
largest housing
and
programs in the country.
Yeah.
All right.
Should we just start talking about universal basic income? How more efficient that would be? No, nothing. Just jokes. Not my recommendations.
Fine, is that anything?
I mean, this is my bill, so I mean, thank you. Hey, we did a good thing by getting it high.
Yes,
Right.
yes.
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah. We just want to make it more accessible to
wait,
a broader swath of families.
I appreciate the recommendation.
Thank you.
Recommendation 6.
In line with what we did last year, so, you know. Thank you.
I have a question about 7, which and I don't know a lot about these processes. It sounds to me, as someone who doesn't know a lot about these processes, very similar to Executive Order 4. The idea of accelerating affordable housing projects through these review permit fee processes at the state level, is there they look the same to me, and I don't know if they are.
I had the same thing. It looks
Okay.
like Executive Order 4, and it also looks like what's part of one of our other subcommittees as well, that's looking into it, which is the regulatory and everything they do. So
It feels like that's where this should look.
there's a momentum
Yeah.
there for
Okay.
both, so. This
I
is
just
kind
want
of
to make
like,
sure I wasn't off, that
No.
those are similar.
I think from recommendation 7, hopefully we'll get from the other subcommittee.
And then I
It'd be
would
very
ask to add to that in that vein, have these been shared with the governor's office? Because perhaps if there's an overlap, it might gain further traction, or maybe our
It's already-
representatives could bring this to the governor's
Yeah,
office.
yeah.
Already,
So I've already had some conversations with them about
Very good.
how Executive Order 4
Right.
dovetails with the recommendation of this task force.
Good, yeah.
sort of what I was alluding to when I said that this to me is a great sort of head start for us and a lot of other work that we've been thinking about. And we'll have to figure that out, right? I think that it's important for us to have, I would almost look at Executive Order 4 and
Does
there's some
everyone know
other
what that
stuff in
is?
there.
Does everyone know what executive? Order
It essentially
4?
asks,
I mean-
the governor's essentially asked his cabinet to do this and some other things that are heavy lifts as well. So yeah, I think we just have to figure out how that works. I'm almost thinking about Executive Order 4 as maybe the implementation phase of some of these recommendations, especially I think that'll come out of the other side. So I'm not sure how that all works, but day 6, we'll figure it
Yeah.
Very much figured like, and then, oh, sorry.
I took my hand down.
Oh, okay.
Oh, and then Amy, I think there's another, if I'm not mistaken, another kind of permit, a recommendation
Yeah,
referring
number
to
8.
fast tracking permits that again would just, as we discussed, recommendation 7 applies to the other recommendation too. So thank you for creating that.
Is that you?
I do want to note that the subcommittee did finalize these recommendations before the executive order 4. So
Okay.
well done on the foresight, everyone.
The momentum is the word you used. That's the right way.
That's because I shared it earlier, the transition committee.
We put that down for like 8, I think, is also recommendation 8 is the same thing. Is that the
Yeah,
one
except
you're
that 8 is designed, infill, specifically thinking about how do we do infill work.
Use existing land.
I do want to just add a little bit of nuance to this discussion from the standpoint that when we talk about permits, a lot of times that's when you already have your building plans and they're going to go in for review and you get your building permit. I believe the spirit of this and probably even Executive Order 4 is even broader because the thing that's taking the most time is if I have property that I need to subdivide or get all these approvals, that's what's taking so much time and money to go through whatever municipalities process. And so I just, for those who aren't in the development roles, there's kind of a number of steps along this way, and all of it has become cumbersome and costly.
Yeah, and our committee did recognize that, time is money in this instance. So, while it's not necessarily a finance thing specifically, if we are financing, the development and the work that's taking place prior to putting, a shovel in the ground, the longer that takes, the longer amount of time that someone is paying, for the land, for the pre-development costs, and paying interest on that expense, leading up to actually getting the permits in hand and starting construction. So by reducing that amount of time, it does create a financial benefit to the developer, and then ultimately to the project.
One question I have probably for this recommendation, but maybe more so for the other subcommittee, is how much brain dump can you do? How much research went into these recommendations at the subcommittee level that can help us to, on Executive Order 4 implementation, jumpstart that process? And you have to answer now. We'll want to know everything you know, so we can start at step 4 rather than 0.
Yeah, and I think that goes into some of our kind of collaboration aspects in the recommendation too, is to have conversations with developers, both nonprofit and for-profit, as these processes are being implemented and evaluated, to understand from them directly, as Preston's got his hand raised, where the pain points are from people who are sitting across the table and trying to get these things approved in addition.
If there's something you have that information, that's what I would love to start with.
Yeah, not to belabor the point, but you have to be very specific on what is meant by expedited permitting. I've had multiple situations where my projects were supposed to be expedited for one reason or another, and I'd go to the state agency and say, well, that 60-day timeline's the exact same timeline I get if I weren't expedited. Aren't you supposed to expedite me? And they kind of look at me with a blank stare, like it says that, but we don't know specifically what that means. And so my advice is if there are specific dates and times, like 60 days, 75 days, you come out and say, but a project that meets these criteria, you respond in 30 days. So there's very specific timelines and deadlines for each agency for a project that's supposed to be expedited.
And just to draw a connection there, I think that's where the definition of affordability comes in. If we're saying we want state agencies to expedite or provide specific incentives, it has to be for housing that ticks those boxes.
And you're right, a percentage of too, because
Exactly.
one unit may or may not trigger that, right?
Exactly. So we would still need, for each program, somebody would have to decide what the threshold percentage.
Okay, so I did want to make sure we turn this over to Rachel. So are there any like last minute burning questions that have to get out before we transition to the next set of recommendations?
Nothing
can-
burning that
And we
can't
can
be
circle
stopped,
back
yeah.
at the end if
Yeah.
there's still
Okay.
time here.
She has fewer recommendations.
So
I'm delaying myself. I'm sorry, just one quick one.
Just telling yourself.
And we can talk, but I wanted to talk with the whole task force about this because I know, and not just wait till after and try to pin you down. Recommendation 11 is a little confusing to me, and maybe it's just the word continues in there, and so I shouldn't be confused. But that's all already, my understanding anyway, is that is already happening, and we're gonna have a source of income law that goes into effect in 2026 that's gonna require it anyway. And so I just wanted to, like, is there something that, is this just keep doing the good work that's already happening, or is there a specific concern, or has what is happening changed?
Yeah, the committee had a lot of conversation around, the fact that production was so important, and yet in the event that we can't produce at the level we need to create, that we may need to consider using those resources for vouchers and other things. So it's just critically important that landlords accept it. So it's a recommendation that's in recognition of the significance of landlords accepting those vouchers. And we know, like we heard about, all the other great work that's taking place. And so we wanted to kind of put a pin in, this is incredibly important. And we want the good work to continue because it will ultimately, a landlord that accepts a voucher is increasing our production because now we have a home that's available to somebody who needs affordable rent.
And if there are reasons why the landlords are not accepting them, let's find out what that is and let's address it.
Okay.
there's still work to do.
Yeah, I'm sure, there's definitely still work. I just want to make sure that once, I guess part of why this was such a big flag in my mind is I just want to make sure that once source of income does go into effect, that our response is about requiring folks to do what the law says, not about encouraging. So
That's a good point. Yeah.
But I think further on that, source of income, that's down here. Getting more landlords with market rent.
Right, they're different. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really, I think, the main goal. I think that's gonna have to be the main goal.
Thanks.
On the DSHA capacity, right, 16. I think I wrote down that I think it's the wrong ask. I think what's helpful is telling the agency what thresholds it needs to meet, rather than suggesting that certain specific actions be taken. If that makes sense.
No, can you clarify?
So, are there delays in processing tax credit applications that are significant to the development process? And if so, what should they be? How many people DSHA has, what DSHA employees are paid I think that's my job, but making sure that we're meeting the needs of our partners is where we can get feedback. Does that make sense?
I understand what you're saying. And we do have a recommendation that's specific to understanding more clearly where the bottlenecks are and getting feedback from those developers. This is in recognition of the fact that if we do get the amount of resources that we think we need do this, that there will be a need for DSHA to increase its staffing and potential capacity and capacity. And that might require asking the state until you earn enough revenue to backfill that for some budget hole filling. And we think that having a competitive analysis will bring a better awareness and argument to the state about what's needed to ensure that you can have the capacity that you need upfront to initiate those programs versus adding staff after you've had to deploy extra $20, for example. as
Yeah,
targeted
so,
revenue.
well, I put the admin part on the 18, that was kind of
Yeah,
16.
yeah.
I just think that what's more helpful than recommendations about competitive wage analysis and things like that are feedback on where the agency's not meeting the right performance measures from the outside looking. And then I think it's up to the agency then to respond to that. But I think I don't disagree, right? I mean, we've had conversations. I don't disagree that we have a situation where DSHA needs to expand and needs to change the way it does business. But
So we didn't have your expertise in the room, right, when we discussed this. So perhaps it's something we change at some point, in my opinion. That we could change to say that we direct the new director to examine and make a recommendation of what he would need to make his staff work efficiently or so, work efficiently.
The flag, the first hand is up.
So from the outside looking in, I know like we're working on a LIHTC deal that's kind of waiting on DSHA. I think this is a great recommendation because it's the turnover of DSHA that can cause delays in a lot of things that you guys are doing. And that causes issues for landlords. So if we're trying to create more housing and maintain housing, making sure that the agency is working as efficiently as possible, I think is critically important. When you've got the high churn, just like with the private market, it causes delays in everything that we're doing. So I think this is a pretty good recommendation, not knowing the inner workings of DSHA.
So I appreciate the conversation around 16. Matt, I think your comments were so nice of me, right? When I initially read it, so and I'll say I like that you said, okay, we didn't have your expertise in the room when we came up with this, and perhaps we can rework some things, right? I like that you said that. I'm gonna be completely honest, guys. When I read this, I felt like I worked at DHSA and I was offended. That's how I felt. So like, if we really want to get to the problems, it's Mike, I just gave you a new name.
Okay.
Yeah, I understand where you're getting, like where you want to get to, but I think we need to use language that does not devalue the people who are already there. That makes sense.
No, I understand. I think we were looking at it in the lens that we did not feel that considering the finance expertise that the individuals at DSHA have, that they are not valued highly enough.
Well, then maybe you should have put that in there. I would not have touched my phone.
Yeah.
And I've never worked with you. I was just
People
like,
should get
oh my
paid
God.
Yeah. I mean, it's just, they're a finance agency and, we feel that as a finance agency, attracting talent is more expensive than.
And again, I don't disagree with any of that. My goal is to make DSHA, a model high-performing housing finance agency and, delivering programs better than anyone. But again, it just feels strange to have task force focused on production, making sort of HR recommendations as opposed to setting goals for the agency's performance delivery.
Well, on a finance and development subcommittee tasked with a certain part of the overall picture, I don't know, I think it's a fair thing to put in to say like, what are some of the pinch points? But I wouldn't get to recommendation 18 and not to kind of value the conversation of 16. And I think this is where we heard a lot of advocates yesterday. Actually, 1%, which of budget, which would be less than this, right?
It would be less than
Yeah.
that.
60 to 70 million.
60 to
Yeah.
70. I mean, we can
And
change it.
And this is where, you get feedback like, oh, but there's a lot of things that got into bond. And if you look at the bond side of things, Delaware Workforce Housing Programs being recommended to be funded there, just passed last year, that there's a lot of other things that are being placed into bond. But what I think bond can change.
Yeah, that's.
And so establishing something from the general fund establishes a consistency of investment. Then that also then leads to 16, which how do you know what to scale when you're subject to bond financing that may or may not be there? But if you have that put into the general fund allocation, then you have something better to plan on the HR side of things. So I think that's why you hear folks advocate for like, great, I see that we're increasing investments on the bond side. Great. And that's why people want to see it shifted at some point in time to the general fund to note the importance of this activity to the state and Delawareans, and therefore you can know what to scale a program to with the right staffing and the appropriate staffing on a consistent basis. But when we create programs because we get an influx of money and then it's out and then it's back in or something else is in there, like that puts a strain on the staff that's there because you have to adjust. And then it's unfair to an agency to like, all right, hey, you now have $100 million more to spend the same staff, but next year you won't.
Yeah, we guarantee it for 1 year.
Yeah. And so
And they had that with ARPA.
do you hire? Yeah, you had that with ARPA and a whole bunch of things. So
Yeah.
you staff up, but then you're in an unenviable position to be like, sorry, that money kind of ran out.
Why does the state do that? Why did the budgeting process do that? Why do we put more in the bond?
Well, that
I-
is not
I-
an answer.
I-
I know,
you don't have to
sorry.
answer
I was
that.
just gonna say.
I'm just like, why
I was gonna say, I'm not gonna answer that for me, because I don't know the answer to that, but I know we have, I'm hoping that, I mean, the governor has talked about putting out a new budget in March.
Mhm.
I don't know if that will look any different. I don't know if anyone here knows if that will look any different, but I think to your point, like having a consistent larger amount that's in the annual, I like that this says annual, that makes me very happy, allocation, not a one-time allocation.
And 30 years,
And I,
30 years to meet today's backlog. Just run.
one of the things I wanted to note about it too is, I think I said this yesterday too, is I think how important it is that it's not program specific, that it really is flexible funds that can be used in these new projects that are coming down the pipeline, regardless of where they're located. And that it's as flexible as possible. Not that the other programs like Strong Neighborhoods aren't needed, but I just wanted to
Are
say.
they gonna
that
be
as
wrapped
well.
into it? I mean, again, I think there's gonna be a really strong analysis of what are the needs and how best to do it? What programs do we offer to provide the housing we needed? And the mixture is usually good. You're encouraging homeownership and you're encouraging rental with some kind of subsidy amount or something, but that's, I agree.
So I was excited to see the 100 million. That's
I'm asking our chairs, do we feel comfortable moving on to Rachel's presentation?
Rachel started it.
I know, it's my fault. It is 100% my own fault.
Why ask us?
Have a stop because I have to pick my child up.
Yeah. Rachel.
Let's
you-
go.
Let's go.
What is our hard stop?
What is the hard stuff?
Our hard top's 3.
My hard stop.
Yeah, I'm always
we're
thinking-
scheduled to meet until 3:30.
Okay.
I have to stay till 3:45, and then I would absolutely need.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Thank you. Good, Rachel.
All right, so I am presenting for the Community Focus Group Subcommittee. The Community Focus Group Subcommittee was charged with looking at the housing needs of specific, and the way that we talked about it a lot in our committee, specific and more vulnerable populations for housing, with representatives from that serve and have experienced housing instability, et cetera, and work with folks who are experiencing housing instability and homelessness and special groups. So we had a lot of conversation about people with disabilities, for example, who are on fixed incomes, seniors who are on fixed incomes, people experiencing homelessness, veterans, et cetera. So our group was a little unique than some of the other groups in the sense that we were also tasked in the legislation with looking at and thinking about support services and like the service angle to housing. So you'll see some of that in our recommendations as well. We cheated, and we have fewer recommendations, but each recommendation has sub-recommendations.
I counted, I know.
Yeah.
I was like, this is not a recommendation.
Like, you know, it's like the big recommendation, but then these are some specific tools for implementing that thing was the way that we were thinking about it. So recommendation one, the unanimous consent among members of the subcommittee that participated was that this was the highest priority recommendation of the subcommittee, which was taking immediate action to increase the stock of supportive housing. Supportive housing being housing that is deeply subsidized to meet the income needs of people who aren't fixed incomes. So that's subsidies for folks who are 50% or 30% below AMI. And that includes support services, sometimes very intensive, sometimes not, but it's really geared towards a population of folks who are going to need an ongoing deep housing subsidy and support services to help them maintain stable housing. Some of those immediate actions that we thought should occur that could help make that happen were that the incoming governor should direct DHSS and DSHA, because again, you need the housing and you need the services for supportive housing, should work together to evaluate needs and create and implement a supportive housing development plan or strategy. Those two entities should be charged with working together to identify housing and services funding, state and federal, that can be used for supportive housing development and operations in Delaware. Had some like what that exactly looks like, I don't know, but we had some conversations about this idea of, about like, could DHSS and DSHA, like, if you're identifying these service dollars could be paired with housing, these housing dollars can meet the income needs of that population. Can we do something like putting out joint RFPs so that the two entities are really working in collectively to ensure that stock gets developed and that the services are there once it does. So that was on the development side. State rental assistance program is a really, really important rental assistance program for more vulnerable and lower income populations, particularly people with disabilities. And it was started, I won't pretend to give the history of SRAP with Director Heckle sitting next to me, because he knows it very well. But it's a really important resource as a housing subsidy for folks. And it hasn't been looked at for a long time in terms of its effectiveness, its ability to meet needs, the quality of services being provided. And so the idea of evaluating SRAP and ensuring that it's really meeting the needs of the most vulnerable renters and potentially funding it to keep up with the increasing and rising costs of rent, so that the number of people being served doesn't continue to decrease, should also be part of that assessment. We also talked about how something that I understand to be true, generally, is that at the state level, legislators and state folks like to match federal resources. Like that's a way to get some additional resources in a pot. So the idea is matching the national housing. Well, we'll see if there's a national housing. If there's a national housing trust fund that Delaware match those resources. There has been for the last number of years, I think 3.5 million-ish. That specifically go to supportive housing to those lowest income folks, and that the state should match the federal allocation if there continues to be one. And 811 units are specific for people with disabilities. Delaware does receive HUD 811 subsidies, and ensuring that those units are being developed and or preserved where they exist is a really important part of making sure that people with disabilities continue to have that type of supportive housing. So that's kind of under that big pot of taking immediate action to increase the stock of supportive housing. I'd rather ask folks to respond now than continue if that's okay, just because that's how my brain works better.
I may have to like come and just spend time with you.
Okay,
Sorry. I was like, no, it's okay. It's all good stuff. I was like, okay, this is a lot. help me operationalize that. So we'll connect.
Okay, yes,
Okay,
let's do
because
that.
it will take up way too much time.
Okay,
Yeah.
let's do that.
I was wondering why you didn't add HUD 202, section 202 to that. That's what, seniors.
That is senior specific rentals.
Maybe
That
we
did
should make,
come up in
or
the
maybe we should
subcommittee.
take advantage of any federal program possible, right?
Right.
Any,
but the allocations are odd, I know.
operating rental assistance programs, yeah.
Yeah. It must be 202 and
Which would be 202 and
811, yeah.
I'm not sure what it means for DSHA to ensure that they're being developed and or preserved. I don't know that that's
Yeah.
a DSHA
Should pursue or
responsibility.
should?
I'm happy to do it, but
So
I
the
don't know what that
discussion
means.
was,
I just, it's draft. I don't.
No,
I don't
no, I
disagree.
know. I just wanted to give you some context for the conversation, and so this language might not actually make sense implementation wise. The discussion was very specifically about how there used to be points in a QAP if you had 811 units in your project, and there used to be 811 units that were built into LIHTC projects.
Yeah.
And that, again, I don't know if we did a deep enough dive into the QAP, especially among the members of our subcommittee to understand this, but there was some sense that that is no longer there. And that we're using, because it's more voucher-based now, and it's harder for people to access units in the community, that continuing to have site-based 811 in LIHTC projects would be a good thing.
Yeah, that was a
But
HUD
it
change
could
more
be,
than,
okay,
okay.
so there, we can
And I would
go down
definitely,
that rabbit hole, but that's where that kind of came from.
and I would
the
definitely
concern that we
decouple it
raised.
from the National Housing Trust Fund because, we might be talking about replacing,
Yes.
the funding that used to be allocated to the state. by the National Housing
Yeah,
Trust,
this was
right?
before, this was drafted before last week. Okay. Should I go to recommendation 2? Okay. Statewide emergency rental assistance program for households in rental arrears. That is sustainable, predictable, and accessible. The reason that sustainable, predictable, and accessible are in there have to do with the one-time ERA funds did a lot of good in a short period of time in terms of keeping Delaware's eviction rates down. And we also know that the governor included in his affordable housing plan when he was running for governor, the idea that some type of consistent rental assistance for low-income households would be something he would support. And so that came up, rental assistance came up a lot in our group, and it seemed like it may be feasible. And so that's where this recommendation comes from. The idea of it being sustainable, predictable, and accessible, really important. I won't take you down that rabbit hole, but those 3 words mean a lot in this sentence. The idea being that if it becomes some type of, wherever it sits, wherever it sits in the government, that it be something that the state continues to implement after ERA funds are, well, I mean, they're basically on that, but not 100%. So,
Zero price tag.
no.
I will note that we did do, and I don't have it in front of me, but some of the math things that we worked on was if we looked at the 19,400 and then we calculated the, average rents, like what amount of assistance would be necessary to help those individuals be stably housed, what that would cost in a year. So
So no,
But
we
this
did
isn't
not.
that though, right? I mean, this is about
No.
preventing.
No, but I see what you're
homelessness.
saying.
This
Yeah,
is about preventing homelessness by giving shorter term, right? Is that what you're talking about?
preventing evictions, yes, for
With
folks.
short term, it's not a rental subsidy, it's not
No,
a voucher, it's a,
not correct.
it's a,
One-time shot in the arm for someone who needs $1,000 because their car broke down and.
But you're broadening it from the existing program. They don't have to be in the eviction process. Is that correct?
It says for renters facing eviction or displacement due to unpaid rent. So I think part of the vision isn't that it, again, in terms of the details of implementation, we got into conversation about like, should there be a fund that literally sits with the right to representation folks? So that when they're showing up at the table in eviction court and this person owes $2,600, they can just pay it, eviction averted, right? Or should it be something more community-based that I think there is not super clear, and I think there's a reason for that. I think we all would have to be more heads together in terms of what that looks like.
The program with the hotel, motel vouchers, that's, and I apologize, I don't know too much about it, but I should know more. Is that state funded or is that federally funded?
Primarily federal.
Okay.
It's the federal I think there's state funds as well that support it, but TANF and a certain type of Medicaid are what make you eligible. And part of the reason for that is because those federal funds can be used for that emergency.
It seems like that could, we could utilize some of that resource there to prevent the eviction, because if we don't, we're paying for the motel space.
Right.
Yeah, I actually,
Might be too logical.
it might be too logical, but also if it is a majority of federal funding, then that doesn't do
Right.
it. But there may be a state match and I'm not totally sure what the answer is.
Okay, thanks. Curious.
Yep. Recommendation 3, Delaware's land use right. Okay, so this is really just all about higher density. Specifically, so conversations were really specific around like Delaware used to have, well, everywhere in the country used to have like SROs. It was not uncommon, until what, the 70s or 80s or something, to have, boarding houses, SROs, really cheap places for people, not a lot of income to stay. I could be wrong, but I think one of the only like official ones left is like the YMCA in downtown Wilmington. And that type of resource, it is not luxury housing, it is very small. But we can and should think about that as an option for folks who are gonna be making $800 a month for the foreseeable future. And we should ensure that our zoning laws allow for that type of production or preservation. But I don't think there's much left to preserve. So, and the other thing that we talked about too was redevelopment. So for example, in Newcastle County, where they just passed the new redevelopment ordinance that has to do with it creates an opportunity for developers to turn old office buildings into like apartments or micro units, very small units. Again, those could be really great opportunities, like old office buildings that aren't functioning anymore, but things like that. So it's not necessarily making new buildings always, but allowing for those things to be built when there's old malls. And there's a lot of them, right? So redeveloping those spaces and being able to make units small enough to meet the income needs of the lowest income folks.
So when there's an old ballpark.
Sure. So that's what that was about.
Number 4.
So this is services. There's a lot of conversation about how when folks who need support services are in housing, even if it's in the private sector, that the lack of consistent service and care that folks get makes them more vulnerable to displacement and eviction, more likely to lose their housing unnecessarily when they could have stayed in their housing, and then they end up in long-term care when that level of care might not be necessary. So this idea that support services really matter for this population, and that there's so much turnover across all the divisions in DHSS. I think coming back to like wages and competitiveness, really looking at how to implement a workforce development strategy in human and social services in Delaware, because that can impact the housing stability of this population.
How dare you want us to not work in our silos? That's what we enjoy doing. It's the truth, like everything is connected.
Unless folks have something on that. Next one is sealing eviction filings that were not, okay. So in Delaware, if you have an eviction filed against you, even if the judgment does not end up being against you, that is visible and can show up. This is not my super area of expertise, so someone can correct me if I use the wrong words here, but that can show up in some type of background check or search by a potential new landlord. So legislation should be passed to immediately seal eviction filings that did not result in a judgment, right? So if I was taken and I wasn't ultimately evicted, the judgment was against me, I was able to pay it off and stay in my unit, that shouldn't show up because that's automatically something that's looked at negatively by future potential landlords. And then we think that even if there was a judgment against the tenant, that after 7 years, it should be sealed. So that folks can at some point escape their past evictions. Currently in Delaware, all of that remains visible forever, and it screens people out of future housing opportunities.
I mean, on this one in particular, a housing provider, a landlord should have as much information as possible. So I'm not sure I would agree with this one, but that's just my comments.
I also have to weigh in from the Delaware Apartment Association. This one, along with recommendation 2 and even 4, seems more about displacement and less about producing more housing. If someone is evicted from a rental unit, that unit is still available. It's just, I think the goal here is to increase the supply of the available housing.
Yeah, I think you're bringing up, one of, I think the challenges that our subcommittee had is that we're part of an affordable housing production task force, but we were also charged with looking at the
Supportive services for and barriers for accessing housing for the specific subpopulations that were represented.
right, so we had a specific charge about barriers to access to housing for these vulnerable populations. And so that's where some of these don't directly link with housing production. And we're very aware of that. So I think that's a good point. I do think though, when folks are displaced and evicted in a tight housing market, there's nowhere else to go, right? And so while we are working to produce, a big part of this is while we're working to produce more housing, the folks who are in housing, the more we can keep folks stable, the better, because there is no other option after that displacement. Once you have a supply that works for folks, they may be able to just find another option. But that's not the case. So that's why this worked its way into our discussion.
And I get it, totally and completely. I get it. A very good friend of mine works full-time, also works gig economy, lives in a fabulous apartment out in Bear, not far from where I live, where there's a pool and a basketball court, because that's where she wanted to live with her family. The reality is she was living paycheck to paycheck, and she was one of those people, not gonna get emotional, where something happened and then she got evicted. And so now my friend had to go and move out of the state to go and live with family so she can try and figure some things out. Even in trying to connect her with affordable housing with one of the entities here that does great work, the question was, has she been evicted? So she'll never, it's hard. And those are the things that we have to think about, because for as much as some people are thinking, oh, you get evicted, it's just because you don't want to pay your bills. That might be the case for some, but the vast majority, that is not the case. And they need us to keep that in mind while we do this work. And I'm sorry I'm getting emotional, but it's just.
And Representative Johnson, I can't agree with you more. And that I see this in our line of work quite a bit. People are working paycheck to paycheck, one flat tire, one sick day away from being in financial trouble. The flip side of that, though, is if an eviction occurs and money is due to a landlord, that loss of income, that money coming in because of the eviction, if it's not paid off, can impact, a property or a landlord in a more large scale, causing rents to increase across the board to offset those losses. So I think, for maintaining, retaining, and avoiding displacement, the sustainable, predictable, and accessible rental aid is critical. And if the state could implement a policy that was much more, or a program, I'm sorry, that was much more efficient than like the current HSP program, which much easier said than done, and structured it in a way where it occurred before a court filing. So the moment you have an issue, when you get a late letter, you're able to get assistance to prevent that court filing. You would avoid a lot of these other issues that you are recommending. A large majority of evictions in Delaware are filed because, they're only a month behind, but we know the process takes months. And as long as the resident is paid, that's the ultimate goal. I tell people all the time, eviction is my last resort. I ultimately want an occupied unit and paid rent. So if we could structure better rental assistance, that helps a large majority of those facing eviction.
Thank you. Anything else on 5? 6 is just an endorsement of a recommendation.
Y'all do that?
Yeah, I don't know if we're allowed to do that, but we did that. We were made aware that yeah, it's cheating. We were aware that the construction subcommittee recommended a statewide building code, and we endorsed that. And further recommend that any statewide building code ensure that new construction is built to meet the accessibility needs of people across a range of disabilities. So we just wanted to make sure that that was considered and a part of whatever that statewide building code would look like. I imagine it would, but this was something that the group wanted to add.
This is just a note, so both the regulatory and permitting and construction subcommittees have approved recommendations to adopt a statewide building code, so we're triple dipping on this one.
I would worry, and this is definitely not my level of expertise, but I would worry, just thinking of like statewide mandate of sprinklers, that's going to drive up the costs of building. So I do worry about that if it starts tackling issues like that.
I 100% agree. I don't think that new production should be made more expensive or stifled by this. I could again, this isn't specific enough in the weeds of that code to make that clear. And maybe we could add some language about that. That's not the intent of this. And I think sometimes things can, not that I do not care about energy and climate and fire safety, but I think sometimes those things actually end up doing more harm than good when it comes to production. And so I hear US, and I actually think maybe we could add something specific about that in there.
And I'll just note, Wes, so there was conversation about the cost of sprinklers that came out of the construction subcommittee. We also had conversations about, when do we use the residential building code versus commercial? There's not a specific recommendation about the residential versus commercial, but I think the general idea is developers don't want to have to deal with 57 different codes. They want to, have one code to operate off of, whatever that eventually ends up looking like. And so when we meet again on the 20th, we will be able to hear directly from Mike Ryman on behalf of construction and David Edgell on behalf of regulatory and permitting more about those.
No, that sounds good. It's just, I think back to I think there was the EV mandate bill that passed the legislature, stuff like that is just acting on the price of housing. So that's my concern. Thank you.
There, you were gonna.
No, I appreciated Rachel saying that they recognize the trade-offs, right? And I think the building code, in particular the IRC, the residential code, because commercial code has to comply with ADA. There are tweaks on the margins we could make, but being mindful of there are trade-offs to everything, right? There are extreme trade-offs with the energy code, right? So we probably would wordsmith because I would want to be careful looking at a regulatory effort. But I appreciate that sentiment.
And I do as well. And to piggyback off of what you said, and I wish I could remember it and completely. This past summer, and it's sad, it's only this past summer, I was in Maryland. And it was for a housing tour. And they took us on a tour of a housing development that was not only going to be energy efficient, but also was going to have solar panels and everything you would want in your house today. And then I'm listening to you guys talk about what those things cost. And then now I'm curious as to how they were able to do that then.
Yeah, so
Tell me.
a little bit.
Okay.
So in certain states, you have the qualified allocation plan, that's provided by the housing finance agencies, and they want to push the envelope of certain technologies, certain things. In some cases, I think almost as demonstrations, and it gets funded by the equity that's being brought in by the tax credits. So is it necessarily always and when tax credits and the cost of construction, same amount of tax credits we've been getting for a number of years, and the cost of construction was lower, it was kind of fun to experiment with that, right?
Right.
But as the cost of everything has gone up, then we don't need to experiment as much. And for example, Matt, director and I talked about this. The code for sprinklers for what's required out of a loan causing tax credit project is more than what, code requires. It's over and above. So there are certain things that, you know, you might want to go over and above with because you're looking for long-term durability and operational costs. And so there are good reasons to do it, but to make it mandates is, you know, gotta balance it.
Was that a multifamily site or a single home that you saw?
I feel like, row homes?
Oh, was it on
Yeah,
the Eastern Shore?
no, Eastern Shore, literally, Baltimore, Maryland,
So, well, I ran a department in Maryland for 5 years and we had a net zero program that helped us do a lot of that energy program
maybe,
that we don't.
think that's what I'm talking about?
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
I told you it's the summer and I don't remember, but,
yeah,
okay,
yeah.
okay.
Their net zero program was very good at a lot of very small developments. But net zero housing, so all of the insulation, all of the passive, power and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, it was great.
So
All right.
I have a question for Rachel. So within the discussion of that committee, did you discuss at all justice involved citizens? Because we have people leaving prisons with only at the most $400. I think that needs to be
Not
addressed.
specific, so actually, yes, but it was discussed mainly in the context of the housing authority program that kind of almost happened and then kind of didn't, but maybe still is.
Family reentry program.
The family reentry program, and that there aren't a lot of great ways to solve for access to the private market for folks that have been justice involved, have criminal
Right,
histories.
right.
But that the housing authorities can and should be doing more to allow those folks to access their housing programs broadly. And live with family, which was the program that you guys started a couple, I guess, COVID time, right before COVID. Yes. So that's was more the context of the conversation. It did not specifically make it into a running.
I mean, a rental assistance, if that SRAP could be possibly.
Right,
So we
that's a
do-
good point. Yeah, that's a good point.
We do actually have a pilot, a reentry pilot in SRAP now.
Oh,
So we
okay.
have
Cool.
set aside 10 vouchers for people who are reentering the community. We have an MOU with the Department of Correction. And so they set the criteria for who qualifies for an SRAP voucher. We've already gotten 2 referrals and one of those people is already housed. And the other one has their voucher and is.
More.
I do want to get to Kevin and then,
Public comment?
and then, yes, we have.
I just had one, and we can talk offline, and it's similar to her question, and I was wondering as it relates to veterans. Like any specific outcomes as it,
Yeah.
recommendations as it relates to veterans.
Yeah, so there aren't any, and I guess I'll say 2 things. So one, our veteran, not to say that this is a good reason, but I think part of the reason why veteran specific issues didn't come up very often is because our one veteran representative did not attend meetings. So that voice just wasn't often present, and I don't know if we made space for it. I don't know if we intentionally made space for it. We'll take some ownership on that. I
You
think.
don't have to.
No,
because
I
we
just think
think
it was
about
listed as a population and there wasn't a lot of
It was a
discussion.
mix, and we
Yes.
were looking for people who had
Right.
that expertise.
Right. And
Are
that,
you of that?
I am not,
There
no.
you go.
So he wasn't there, and unfortunately, I know, I mean, I'll just take up time. I was gonna start talking about veteran homelessness, but I'll stop.
All right.
I do have another note related to that.
Okay.
So, we are seeking a change to the epilogue language for the SRAP program to allow us to partner with federal agencies. So right now, the way SRAP is structured, we can only receive referrals from state agencies. However, we would like to partner with the VA in Wilmington to be able to provide SRAP vouchers to their clients. We cannot do it with the way the current epilogue language reads, so that change is in the, whichever budget bill it is, that language has been introduced, we just have to have the bill passed.
That's awesome. That's great.
When you say, okay, never mind. I have a lot of questions about that.
And Kevin has been waiting so patiently.
Later.
Thanks. Regarding recommendation 6, I had to step out for a moment, but I did have a comment on the last piece. We are certainly supportive of housing folks with disabilities. I do need to let you know that trying to ensure compliance with ADA, though, will limit density, especially with townhome development, where there's a requirement for a bedroom to be on the first floor. So then you'd have to make the units wider. Again, what we build, but I think that needs to be understood. Thanks.
Thank you, Kevin. I don't know, I mean, that specific information wasn't talked about, but there was a conversation you might have missed about maybe editing some of this language, because the goal isn't to make it harder to build, but just to ensure that there is some incorporation of the needs of people with disabilities in new units. And so doing that in a way that doesn't increase cost or make it harder to build is important.
Across the board.
Across the
Because you're
board.
talking about us, you know, a
Right,
statewide
right.
building code, you're hitting everything.
Right, so, yes, point taken, and there was a kind of a discussion about how that could backfire in some ways, or I don't know if that's the right word, but
Unintended consequences.
unintended
Yeah.
consequences, thank you.
Yeah.
A little editing.
Thanks.
Public comment.
All right, cool. Okay, let me get back to my slide. Oh, come on. Here we go. Okay. At this point, if anybody would like to give public comment, please raise your hand either virtually or in group. Waltz. I am going to stop share real quick and bring up a timer. We typically give people 2 minutes to provide public comment. However, we do allow 3 minutes for persons with disabilities if they request that accommodation. Really just need for this to work right now. And while I'm bringing this up, Mr. Walls, if you'd like to come closer to the table near one of the speakers, please.
Sure.
I'm going to start the clock now.
Thank you. My name is Joe Walls. I'm the CEO of Veteran Services. We advocate for incarcerated veterans, trying to get them out of prison and into housing and reentry services. First, I want to thank Representative Johnson for bringing up the veteran issues. I really appreciate that. I know that Cindy Romer had talked to you a little bit about that. And Caitlin, I think. No. Rachel, I'm sorry. I talked to her too, I believe, about that. The eviction records. I'm a landlord in Smyrna. I only rent to people that have vouchers, HUD vouchers in particular, but also SRAP. Why I have to consider eviction records, I don't know. Because I understand I'm dealing with the troubled population. We're dealing with people that are drug addicted, mentally ill, whatever problems they have. They have problems with handling their finance. When you, as a landlord, you take these people on, you put them in a place, the Delaware State Housing Authority, the funding that they provide, the fair market rent, is excellent. It's excellent. It's, you know, it goes from $1,400 for 1 bedroom. Now it's over $2,000 for a 3-bedroom place. So why are we considering evictions? I don't understand why that's even allowable, because that is like assumed within the rate that you're paid that there's extra expenses involved. On the pay for Delaware State Housing Authority, sir, I want to disagree with you. I believe that all state workers are underpaid. Them people in the Delaware State Housing Authority have too much work to do. when I was a prisoner in DOC, I used to go out of my way to talk to rookies. And across the board, the only reason they were quitting was because of the working conditions. The amount of work that was put on them, or they felt they weren't being respected. It had nothing to do with the money.
Well, your time has expired.
Oh, is that right?
Yes.
Anyway, you get the general gist.
So I'm sure that the public comment part is not a dialogue so much, but I just want to clarify. That's not what I meant at all with my comment. My comment was about about the recommendations being focused on on sort of outcomes and that it is really more my job to make sure that whatever capacity is needed at DSHA is there to meet those outcomes. I completely agree. The people at DSHA work extremely hard. A lot of them have been there for a long time. So I worked there 8 years ago for about 12 years. Some of them are still there. A lot of them are still there because it has been a very good place to work. And we need to make it better. And that is about compensation. It's about organizational structure. It's about engagement. It's about a lot of things. So I've been an employee of government my whole career and value as much as anyone and more than a lot of people. The contributions of state employees and DSHA employees to the work here. It's
A sense that you're bringing a grassroots type energy into the organization that they need.
Yeah, so I just wanted to be clear because you said I don't disagree with you at all, or with the recommendation that there are structural and compensation issues.
I fight with your people all the time.
I
Make
hope
no
so.
mistake about that. I mean,
And I look
they
forward
get
to
my
fighting with you,
email.
sir.
But I still respect what they do because they take the time to explain things to you, and they're doing the best they can.
No, I just wanted to make sure that what I said was clear.
I'm gonna make sure she picks her kids up.
Okay. If anybody online would like to give public comment, please raise your hand now. And to our 3 co-chairs, I am not seeing any raised hands at this time. As always, we will accept written public comment. I have to be muted
Okay.
here, otherwise.
Sorry, okay, sorry.
Yeah, so as always, if you would like to submit written public comment, please send it to housing.taskforce@delaware.gov. Any public comments received within that time frame will be appended to the meeting minutes for this meeting. Turn it back over to our chairs at this point.
We still have 6 minutes.
No, fine.
So my question is, as the new guy, sort of procedural, what happens when the subcommittees submit sometimes, almost 20 recommendations? Does the task force vote to? So what do we do with that as the full task force? Are we supposed to be bringing all of them through? Are we prioritizing? Is there a process that happens there?
Well,
have we talked about that?
We have not really talked about that. But
Okay.
I think what ends up happening.
We didn't think there would be 18.
Right.
Next from chair subcommittee.
And I think some of them can be, boiled into almost like what Amy mentioned. There's gonna be some that are gonna be legislative things that we're gonna work on. Some are like internal things that you're working on. Some recommendations are, however they're gonna work out. I think, we have the dialogue. We can figure out collectively what boils out into the report that really does address also the production aspect of it, which was what the original charge was. So there are some things that are just going to be probably falling out because we might not see the value of it adding to what this task force was supposed to be in charge of. But it's still, by this having these meetings, like there's things that Amy dropped that it just we'll kernel out there, and somebody maybe not even you know, somewhere else, and not just in this room, and say, you know what? Let me see if I can run with something.
So is it your expectation that the full task force then will engage in sort of an editing and prioritization process, or not?
Or will we vote on like every single one?
Possibly.
Okay.
Yes, it all depends on how much time that will take, and how many recommendations we get from the other 3 subcommittees. And through the different task force that I'm on, there were recommendations that weren't nearly as, you know, lengthy as this.
Yeah.
And we did put it to the original task force members as a draft and got comments. And then the people who are responsible for putting together the report took some of those potential edits and said, all right, I'm not going to include that. That doesn't really, you know, I get it, but we don't need it. You know, there was some editorial privilege that was granted to the report writer.
Gotcha.
If I could just add, so one of the things that I did for dealing with the subcommittees is I created a Google survey with all of the draft ideas that they had. I then had members rank the importance of each recommendation, like what do you really, really want the task force to hear? And then, you know, what are things that are maybe not as important to elevate? And so based on those survey results, that was the order in which the subcommittees actually discussed, wordsmithed, and approved recommendations. So I think after the February 20th meeting, once we've heard all 5 sets of subcommittee recommendations, we take a look at it, maybe we get some sticky notes out, see if there are recommendations that could potentially be combined.
Yeah.
I'm thinking specifically of, you know, finance and development says we should have more incentives. I'm pretty sure regulatory and permitting has specific examples of incentives that they want to be done. So maybe those 2 recommendations get married into one, and then we put in what we think should be the final roster, have everybody rank or prioritize those, and then when we meet on the 13th and the 20th, that's the order in which we go through and hopefully vote.
And then what's the next step? Then the report's given to the General Assembly, and then there's some things then are there bills then passed that directing some things to the director of DSHA, and some that are morally needed to be legislative bills and.
So the HB 442 requires that the report be given to the governor and the General Assembly, so they'll all be in receipt of it. Yeah, I think some things will be turned into legislation. We could run resolutions to direct specific agencies to do specific things. I don't know if that's necessarily necessary, if there's
I didn't know, yeah.
commitment of that director to do whatever the thing is.
Or in this case, it'd be up to. I can look at these and say, I'm gonna do this, I'm not gonna do this, I'm gonna do this. I mean, I'm just wondering, you know, what. Don't know.
Yeah, and that's gonna be a prioritization of the director, seeing where his
Maybe with the
resources are,
governor,
to see how
right?
I can,
Yeah.
how they can assist, and there might be something that, you know, he might say, like, I'll get to that. But I've got this to do first.
Right.
And then the other thing to note is the task force dissolves when the final report is submitted. So at that point, we will no longer.
And speaking of that, I know
You
that.
don't want the work to end, right?
Well, so there are examples of this. I know Senator Hansen has a energy stakeholders group that meets at least monthly, maybe every other week. And that's something I think I've already pledged in some of the meetings that I would be happy to have, like quarterly meetings of this group to see how things are progressing, see how things, you know, that we might need to, like, you know, that come up based upon those unintended consequences of things that we have done, or positive things that you like, encourage us. So I don't mind taking that role on as far as still convening the group from time to time, just to see how we're doing on achieving our goals, because, you know, we're having all these recommendations, and we hope that outcomes come from that. And if we just offer the recommendations and then don't measure those outcomes by convening the group to see how we're doing with those outcomes, then we really haven't done the work that we need to do. So I don't mind taking on that myself, or with brand.
Yeah, I'm like, where's Brandon? Brandon and Valeria?
I was just about saying
We've done the same thing, Senator Mangiavinos and I've done the same thing with the caucus on aging, you know, because that's how it's like, you don't do this thing and just be like, okay, we're done, the world's fixed. You know, you gotta come back and evaluate what's happening, and it's now 3:32, you can blame him. New guy.
Who to adjourn?
Then there's a second.
Thank you,
Thank you.
I stopped talking before.
You were like, we got 6 whole